10 the podcast, 10 minutes every 10 days. My name is John Wilkerson. Today I thought I'd cover a topic that I have changed my mind on. You see, for a while I was really down on the Christian film industry. And so I would actively avoid watching any Christian films. And because of that, it kind of made it seem like, I don't know, maybe I was against the industry or whatever you want to say there. And I was listening to the Phil Vischer podcast, I think it was. And there was some talk about Christian media and the production of Christian media. And one of the hosts brought up a very important point. You know, they were talking about the sad state of Christian media, whether it was music or movies or whatever. And one of the co-hosts said, well, how are they supposed to learn? How are they supposed to develop their craft if they're not going out and producing content? See, a lot of people complain about the quality of faith-based content, whether it's the acting or the directing, the overall production of a movie or a book or what have you. And one of the things that we seem to forget is that all of the great actors, all of the great directors were bad at one point or another. Scorsese and Spielberg and the Coen brothers, they weren't always good directors. Actors like Patrick Stewart and Julia Roberts and many others that we consider some of the best actors that are out there weren't always good. And they had to learn. And they had to be in some stinkers of movies or plays or TV shows or whatever they were in order to work their craft. Maybe they went to film school. Maybe they went to acting school. And these are all things that we should probably encourage Christian artists to do too, is continue to educate themselves in whatever field they're creating content for. But they all had to learn at some point. They all had to develop the skills to become good at what they're doing. And I think we don't give a lot of grace that we should be giving to Christian artists, whether they're actors or directors or writers or musicians. I don't think we give enough grace to them because it's so public. The Christian industry has come into the public. It's become a ghetto unto itself. And so the idea here is that we get people in the movies and writing books and in TV shows, which I don't know that anyone's really creating Christian TV shows, but that's beside the point. But we get the leavings, or the ones who couldn't cut it in Hollywood. And I think with music that's become less the case. And there are a few writers that necessarily may not fit that bill either. But as a whole, We get people who are still developing their craft. And what sometimes happens is once these artists get to a point where their craft is so good and they're recognized by the industry at large, they stop producing content exclusive to the Christian market. And now they've sold out, or whatever word we want to use for that to make it sound negative, right? So as these people are developing their craft and they're developing their skills, we're seeing it, and it rises above the even worse stuff that's out there. I mean, have you seen a sci-fi original movie lately? Are they getting better? Certainly, but when they started, they were junk. They were garbage. And some people might say, well, that has to do with the money that goes into them, that has to do with the production studios. And we're starting to see studios like Sony that have a faith-based branch, Affirm Films, that are now able to provide a little bit more money to faith-based films, and they're able to provide an influx of cash into the Christian film market, if you will. So where do we go from here? How do we develop the faith-based film? Should we be making family-friendly content or content exclusive for the faith-based audience? I mean, there's content that's made exclusively for the horror genre, and there's content that's made exclusively for comedy or action genre. And when it comes to faith-based films, that can kind of bleed over into multiple genres. So how do we continue to develop that? And how do we handle some of the factors that go into the production of a film? For example, I have a friend who is a film writer. He writes screenplays. And I think he writes great screenplays. But if he sells his screenplay to a production company, and maybe he even knows the person who's going to be directing the film. So let's assume that this isn't the person's first film that they're directing, but there's just no money for actors that have done this before, or people who do principal photography, or people who do the sound design, or the costuming, or whatever the case. There's so many factors that go into making a good film, most of which we don't recognize and acknowledge. I mean, think about this. When you watch a good film, most people don't say, wow, the costume designer did a good job. It just seems natural in the film. Most people don't recognize the sound design. But when it's bad, when the costuming is bad, it sticks out. When the sound design is bad, it sticks out. When the special effects are bad, it really sticks out. Had a sudden change of venue here. So how do we handle this? How do we deal with the situation? We have people who could write a good script, or who act well, or can direct well, or can do good costumes, or whatever the case may be. But it's not necessarily possible to get all the good factors into an episode. So I think it's time for us in the Christian film community, and those of us who are Christians and are reviewing films or like to watch films, I think it's time for us to look at what's good in the films and praise it. And I'm not saying don't be critical of a bad product and don't mention it and ignore it. But I think too often we want to say that everything about faith-based films or Christian films is bad, when in fact there's a lot of things that are out of a writer's control or a director's control or even an actor's control. So let's start looking at it from that point of view. I'm John Wilkerson. You've been listening to 10 the Podcast, 10 minutes every 10 days. Thanks for sticking me in your ears.